No, Gar, no! Don't look at the light! Hello there, and welcome to Magic by Design. This week we are talking about A Bug's Life, first released in 1998. But before we dive in and examine every grain of Pixar's second movie, allow me to introduce my co-host slash brother, Garrett. Gar, how are you?
Bzz. Sorry, Ken, I looked into the light. If I were a bug, I'd definitely be stupid enough to fly into the bug zapper.
It's so beautiful.
I'd be like, ooh, ooh. Why are bugs attracted to light? Is it just like a dumb thing in their brains that are just like, ooh, we must go into it?
Maybe they think it's God or something.
Some kind of food? Let me Google why are bugs attracted to light while you do the rest of the intro.
That's it.
Okay. Why? Oh, it's clearly a thing people... Like a moth to a flame or a lamp, insects are drawn to bright lights because they confuse the animal's navigation systems. So they basically like see the light and their brain shut down. They're like, fly into it.
It's like a homing beacon. But if you go back to Wreck-It Ralph, Gar, the bugs are attracted to the light source.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
So it's
pure science.
That's basically a sequel to Pixar's A Bug's Life, which we're talking about today.
Speaking of, Gar, been a long time for me since I've seen A Bug's Life. Again,
as I mentioned last week, I did a little Pixar rewatch that I didn't finish in like, I don't know, that would have been like 2010-ish. So I would have watched it then, but I don't really remember watching it then. I played the video game last year, so I do remember a lot of the beats from playing the video game, which is bad. Don't play the PlayStation 1 A Bug's Life game. It's not very good at all.
There's a bit at the start that mimics the movie where he's leaving the colony and you float on the dandelion stem
across the canyon.
Yeah, and I could never get it right.
It's actually very easy when you play it back now. It's funny to go back to games like that where it's like, as a child, I found this the most difficult thing in the history of the world. And then I just did it in one go when I played the game last year. It's like, oh, this is actually quite easy. You just float across the whirly things.
Yeah, maybe it's just the experience and spatial reasoning and all that.
Yeah, and like video games have a language to them. And the more video games you play, the easier video games become. Because you're like, oh, I saw that in this game, or I saw that in that game. Or like, different series have their own language. So the hardest, like, Metroid game you'll ever play is the first Metroid game you play. Because you won't have understood the language of the Metroid world. But by the time you finish that one, you'll be like, oh yeah, we'll get to the next one. It's like, this is what I do here, this is how this works, I have to go here and get this new thing. You understand the language of video games, Ken. Which is why people struggle to play them sometimes. Like you.
Yeah, I'm a baby gamer.
Baby gamer. Alright, Ken, coming straight in here. Is A Bug's Life... We talk a lot these days about B-tier Pixar.
This is an interesting question. I've been pondering this.
Is A Bug's Life actually the birth of B-tier Pixar?
Now, Gar, we'll go into the details, but I really struggled over this because I have quite an affinity for this film. I saw it in 1998 on a class trip when I was 9.
Yeah.
And I think it does the film a disservice to call it B-tier Pixar.
Why?
Because I think there's a lot of great things going for it, like the voice cast, the score, the story.
See, I think that's true of most B-tier Pixar. For example, the film that just came out, which we'll talk more in depth in 15 episodes or whatever.
15? It's more like 22.
Whatever, however many Pixar films there have been. Luca, which has a great script, it's very pretty, has a nice central story. It's B-tier Pixar.
Interesting.
Pixar. I've now dubbed it Pixar.
I wouldn't call it a classic, much like Luca. It's not up there with Toy Story and your best Pixar films. But I do think there's a possibility of a B+, Gar. What do you think?
Yeah, but I kind of bring it up because there's this kind of myth out there that Pixar's lost it. You know?
Yeah.
That Pixar, this creative giant who created these intricate, detailed, interesting worlds, no longer has that same capacity to create things that interesting. Which I think is untrue. And I think what makes it even more untrue is when you watch A Bug's Life and realize, yeah, some of their films are only just very good. You know?
Yeah.
And like B-tier Pixar sounds like an insult. But B-tier Pixar is better than the vast majority of animated movies. Like B-tier Pixar versus B-tier Disney. Like B-tier Pixar is A-tier Disney. You know, that's the gap between these two studios in terms of their general output. But I kind of like the idea that, like, there's always been these films in the Pixar canon.
Yeah, it's true. And like that's another thing I've been thinking about, because you can't all have these classics with these big themes. And there are some interesting themes in this film. You can't always have like these emotional masterpieces. I'm not saying that these films are bad, as you said. Sometimes they put out something and the conditions are the same, but there's reasons why some films are embraced like that and other ones aren't. What I like about Luca and films that they've done recently, whether they're successful or not, is they're bringing in different voices and different types of people to direct these films.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's 24 Pixar films now. They're not always going to be that top-tier film that could be considered one of the best animated films of all time. You can't do that every time. And sometimes to get to that level, you have to experiment and maybe not reach the mark.
Yeah, and, like, they're not all swinging for, like, high-minded conceptualness. In the same way that, like, WALL-E is, or Inside Out is, or Monsters, Inc. is. You know, these different worlds with different ideas, and, like, they're so imaginative and creative. Like, this one is, like, what if we lived in an ant colony? Which is not, like, a difficult, like, conceptual idea. It's not, like, a bunch of monsters living, scaring children under their beds at night. It's not, what if you went inside your head and saw all your emotions come to life? It's not, what if we went to the afterlife and we did all this stuff in the afterlife? It's very simple. You know, it's not some high-minded, high-concept thing. It's bugs. That's it. It's just bugs. And that's fine. That's okay. It's okay that they're just like, what if we just do a bug movie?
But I think the interesting challenge there is making these small, insignificant creatures and stories, their lives, into something that's compelling.
So yeah, I would say A Bug's Life is B-tier Pixar.
I'm going to give it a B+.
I keep calling it Tixar. B-tier Pixar. That's hard to say.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a B+.
You're going to keep it out of the B-tier period?
I'm going to put it somewhere in the middle.
You're creating a new tier?
Right in
like
the
top
fence.
tier Pixar, B-tier Pixar, and then like A- or B+ tier Pixar.
Are you going to be able to say Pixar?
It's very difficult to say tier Pixar, because you want to say tier Tixar.
Tier Pixar.
It's very upsetting.
During the summer of 1994, Pixar began thinking about their next film. The storyline for A Bug's Life originated from a lunchtime conversation between John Lasseter, Pete Docter, and Joe Ranft. It's a hard name to say. Other films, such as Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, and WALL-E, were conceived at this lunch, which is amazing.
They just sat down for lunch and planned out like 7 movies, and they're like, there we go, that's all of our movies.
And they all came to be, which is very interesting.
There's going to be one where a robot lives on a desolate planet, and he's cleaning it up by himself. There's going to be one where monsters scare a bunch of kids to create energy for their world. There's going to be... and bugs. Let's do bugs.
During an early test screening for Toy Story in June 1995, they pitched the idea of the film to Disney's CEO Michael Eisner. Eisner thought the idea was fine, wasn't too enthused, and they submitted a treatment to Disney in early July under the title Bugs. As you said, Gar, bugs. It's just bugs. Disney approved the treatment and gave notice in the same month that they were exercising their option of a second film under their original 1991 agreement with Pixar.
So Disney are once again producing and, distributing these films and financing them. And typical Disney, they're like, do you think there's an amount of hubris in Disney at the moment?
Yeah.
Where it's like, this bug movie, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's no Little Mermaid, but it's fine.
Yeah, you can have your money. Production on A Bug's Life began shortly after the release of Toy Story in 1995. John Lasseter returned to direct, went straight to work on this film after finishing Toy Story. Lasseter assigned Andrew Stanton as co-director. He realised during working on Toy Story as a sole director that it was dangerous because it's a young medium. A lot of time, a lot of energy.
Basically giving your life to these movies.
Yeah, so he believed that it would relieve stress and the role would also groom Stanton to be able to have his own film as lead director in the future.
Which, yeah, you see this a lot with, even on the Disney side of things, a lot of people who are like lead animators and lead, increasingly step up into bigger creative roles and take on director's roles. There's a nice little talent pipeline going on in all of these studios.
Yeah, they also use the shorts as a training ground.
Yeah, so it's like, hey, go make a nice short. Oh, that short sucked. You're not making the next movie. Your short was good. Make a movie. The
director of Luca also directed the short film La Luna, which was nominated for an Oscar.
Which one was La Luna?
When they go to the moon and they're harvesting stars.
I don't remember it.
Yeah, well, there you go. The screenplay was written by Stanton and comedy writers Donald McEnery and Bob Shaw from a story by Lasseter, Stanton, and Ranft.
Bugs. The story was just bugs.
The fact that comedy writers punched up this script really shows. The jokes are sharp and plentiful.
Yeah, it's I'm not going to say it's like a super funny film, but it is a film that tries to be like lighthearted and whimsical at pretty much all times.
Yeah, and each character has their own personality and some really good lines in there. The film was released in November 1998 and grossed $363 million at the box office, just shy of $600 million in 2021 money. The budget was 4 times that of Toy Story at $120 million. So very profitable, but also they really ramped up the production in this. Understandable because, as we said, Toy Story was made with a team of 25 people.
Here's the question, Ken. Do you see that money in the finished product?
I do think there's a lot of flexing in terms of the actual environment, maybe not so much the characters. You see like the leaves and the water and the terrain. We'll go into it in the animation, but they invested a lot of money into invoking that feeling or that look of translucency. So a lot of money went into that as well.
Because I would say you don't, but in terms of like, does this film look appreciably like better than Toy Story? It does, as you said, it does and it doesn't. In that, I think there are shots of the characters that look actually kind of bad. Either like very close-ups or wide shots all look quite bad.
Yeah.
But like normal distance shots look fine. And as you said, all of the environments actually look very nice. And all of like the grass stalks and the leaves and like the dandelions look borderline photorealistic at some stages. And like all the flowers and the water in particular is like, look at it, except at the end with the rain. There is parts of it that are like, oh yeah, this is like super duper photorealistic. You're nailing this anime. And then there's parts of it where like, oh, that's some 90s computer animation right there.
I agree. My main takeaway was that they're flexing straight out the gate on the animation with the uncanny depictions of nature, but the infancy of this style of animation shows a lot more in the film than in Toy Story. I think the characters, the goal was to make the ants in the film more appealing, so they redesigned them. They removed mandibles and stuff, for example.
Yeah, but what they do is they end up like smoothing the ants so that they just look like blue and purple globs.
Yeah, there's no texture to them.
No.
Although there is quite a lot of texture to the grasshoppers. So
yeah, so like they put a lot of effort into making the grasshoppers look like grasshoppers, but then all the ants just look like blue and purple globs. And I think probably the reason for that is there's a lot more ants on the screen at any given moment. So if they were to go into a greater deal of detail in each individual ant, just think when they do the wide shots of the ants, how much of a nightmare that would become. So perhaps they were like, all right, we're going to keep the ants relatively simplistic because we're going to do wide shots that have like hundreds of them in the shot.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because like toys, insects felt within the reach of the computer animation back then due to their relatively simple surfaces. The story's scale required software engineers to accommodate new demands, including, as you said, multiplying lots and lots of ants. It was impractical for animators to control them individually, but neither could the ants remain static for even a moment without appearing lifeless or move identically. So they're trying to balance that out because you don't want the ants to have no personality, but also it'll take a really long time to animate them individually.
I do like when there's like wide shots when they're like pulling things and they're all coming together. It's like, which one is Flick?
Yeah.
You're like playing the which one is one of the main characters game.
Bill Reeves, one of the film's two supervising technical directors, dealt with the quandary by leading the development of software for autonomous ants. The animators would only animate 4 or 5 groups of about 8 individual universal ants. Each one of these universal ants would later be randomly distributed throughout the digital set. The program also allowed for each ant to be modified in subtle ways, example, their eye color or skin, different heights, different weights, etc. And they did try to vary them a bit, but yeah.
Did they really though? Like, Flick looks a lot like the rank and file ants. And to be fair, like Princess Ada, Dot, the mother ant, Queen, whatever her name is. Like, they do all... I think she was just called Queen. I think they do all... Like, those characters look different. You'll never, like, miss those for anybody else. But when you see Flick in, like, wide shots of lots of ants, you will mistake him for the rest of the ants. I think he has, like, bigger eyes. As with all Disney Pixar characters. They just have bigger eyes.
In practice, it meant that no 2 ants were the same. But, as you said, it does all blend in, so you don't really notice. So
yeah, I refuse to accept that, like, no 2 ants are the same. Like, maybe one is, like, a half... Like, this one is 2.4 centimeters tall. This one is 2.5.
A lot of time and effort went into that, and then the animators also employed something called subsurface scattering, developed by Pixar co-founder Edwin Campbell during his graduate student days at the University of Utah in the 70s to render surfaces in a more lifelike way. So subsurface scattering is a mechanism of light transport in which light that penetrates the surface of a translucent object is scattered by interacting with the material and exits the surface at a different point. So that's how they were able to create light through the trees and the leaves. And
so basically they're trying to get light to act like light actually acts.
Yeah.
Which is tremendously difficult to do unless you create some kind of process to do it like that. Because imagine trying to do that organically, trying to like be like, all right, where should this light come out? And how does that make sense? And we have to do that for every time there's a light source in the movie. And this movie is set pretty much entirely outside. So at all times, the sun should be doing something.
Yeah, so it really is a feat. And I think that's where most of the money went into production of this film. And it does show.
Just the light, just to make the light look good.
Interesting note here, Gar. Catmull asked for a short film to test and showcase subsurface scattering. And the result was Jerry's Game, 1997, which featured before this film.
We didn't see it.
No, we didn't in this, but in the theatres it showed, Jerry's Game where he's the old man outside playing chess. He also has a cameo in Toy Story 2.
I think I've seen all of those shorts, but I don't remember them. Because I remember there was like a DVD that was released that was like all Pixar shorts.
Yeah.
I think you had it.
I had a couple of them, yeah.
Yeah, so I think I watched those at one stage. So I've probably seen it, but I don't remember it.
The whole point is that they're playing chess in the park, so you see the trees and all that. So
And all the light going through the trees.
yeah.
And flexing with their light.
I do see the flexing in terms of the environment. I think that's a huge step forward.
It's the character models that are let down.
Yeah. But interestingly, though, as you said, the water looks great, except for the end when they try to do rain. It just doesn't work at all.
Well, you see, what they tried to do is they tried to do rain from the perspective of ants.
Yeah.
Like, they can do normal rain because you can do a wide shot and it's just rain. It looks fine.
Yeah.
But they're trying to do rain from the perspective of a tiny creature for which rain is like this catastrophic event.
Yeah.
So, like, every drop of rain is like a tiny tidal wave for an ant. And they tried to depict that. And at times, when they're on land, it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, when for the rain first starts falling and it's like huge droplets covering people. But then they do a sequence where they're flying over water and the rain is falling. And it looks kind of bad.
Yeah, or it's landing on the grass. So, like, they couldn't replicate naturally how the water would fall and disperse.
Especially at that scale. That's the thing. At the tiny... Because a raindrop, relative to us, is puny. A raindrop relative to an ant is quite large. So they tried to depict it as a raindrop relative to an ant. But I don't think they quite had the technology to really show that in a way that looked good.
The film was initially inspired by Aesop's fable, The Ant and the Grasshopper. The idea of that is that the grasshopper messes around all summer and doesn't collect enough food and then begs the ants for food who say no. So they flip that. So it's basically an extortion racket.
Yeah.
They're the mob.
They're shaking people down for all of their grain.
Another interesting note here is that they initially had the circus folk as somewhat villains that were pulling the wool over the eyes of the ants.
Oh, so that they showed, instead of Flick bringing them back as heroes deceiving the ants, it was the circus folk coming in by themselves as like, we can save you, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that made them much less appealing. So the story was changed to a comedy of errors as such, where Flick sees them in the bar, thinks that they're warriors, but they're actually just performers. I think that's much better because the film pitches Flick as a bit of a screw-up, and he means well. He gets the wrong end of the stick quite a lot.
But it turns out he's a genius visionary, Ken. It's just people need to embrace his ideas.
Yes, of course. But one note I have here, Gar, the bit about ants freaking out when encountering an obstacle that breaks their line is very amusing.
Yeah. It's like, what do we do?
We're going around the leaf. Around the leaf.
Even like a few seconds later in that scene, it's like, the line! There's a gap in the line! It's fine. We're gonna be fine.
But like that's what I like about this film because, you know, obviously ants, if you walked past an ant today in a line, you might pay attention like, oh, there's some ants. But like, it means nothing. It's inconsequential. But in that world, breaking the line, is a catastrophic event because...
Yeah. Their world is tiny and their world is built on order, and once order is detoured from, they panic and they freak out. And there's like even moments whenever anything goes wrong, they just like all scatter in all different directions, running and fleeing. And they even turn that into a bit at the end when like the bird shows up, or like the fake bird, Flick's fake bird, and they see the fake bird and they're like, we're on.
Yeah, they're part of the performance. But in general, I do love the way they visualized what a world and city populated by bugs would look like. So for example, their civilization sprung up around trash, like real bugs.
Yeah.
So like it's literally a pile of trash, but it's become this city. I also thought the circus was especially well done because it's basically animal crackers.
I remember the city sequence of this film being longer.
Yeah, because like he pretty much just
goes there, gets them, and leaves. It's like a 7-minute sequence of the movie, and he's already back at the ant colony.
Yeah, I thought it was like a whole thing where he was on a bit of a journey for at least like 15 minutes. But...
No, he's just straight back there. He's like, he goes there to do a dramatic, horrible circus performance with flaming death, which becomes a callback later in the film, which this film does a good job with, between the stone thing and the flaming death. Like, there's little seeds planted that are called back toward the end. It's like, that makes sense. Good job.
And even Hopper's demise, because, you know, as you said, they have the fake bird to trick him. He finds out it's not real, and then Flick cleverly leads him to the real bird, who we see earlier in the film, who is like a mid-film threat that solidifies the ant colony thinking that the circus performers are heroes. And it comes back at the end because he leads him there and he's like, oh, this is another one of your contraptions, is it? And it's a real bird. So very good.
Why are the ants alive but the birds aren't? Because it's an interesting perspective thing, that we see the perspective of the ants, who are generally considered the good guys. Yeah. We see the perspective of the grasshoppers, who are generally considered the bad guys. And then the bird is just like this neutral chaos.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting as well, though, because if we look at the bird, we sympathize with the bird because it's a pretty bird, and the bird is just trying to feed itself and its family. So the bird is not doing anything wrong, but the bird becomes, as you said, a source of chaos, or is just one of those factors in the world that feels menacing, even though it's really just a bird.
Yeah, it's just a bird hanging out. But how come it's not personified, Ken? How come the ants are personified, but the bird isn't?
Yeah, that's an interesting choice. I think it's like the way they do it in the film, it almost feels like the bird is the T-Rex,
or like
from Jurassic
almost
Park.
like a god.
Yeah.
A god that floats over all of these insects. And it is like, they even like offhandedly mention, it's like the circle of life, like the Lion King.
Yeah.
But it is the circle of life. The ants feed the grasshoppers feed the birds feed other birds, depending. I don't know, what do birds feed?
But I think if they personified the bird, they ran the risk of people identifying with the bird, where the bird is just supposed to be kind of
neutral chaos.
Yeah, a plot point as such, Garrett, speaking of Hopper, what do you make of him as a villain? One note I have here, it's ironic that Kevin Spacey played a villain in so many things, because he ended up being a literal villain in real life.
Yeah, bad person. We're cancelling everybody in these movies. It's a good performance. He's a good actor.
Yeah.
Like people, I don't like the people who like, that person is a bad person, therefore I will reject all of their work and pretend it's bad. It's like, no, he's a good actor who has good performances.
Yeah.
He's just a piece of shit. Yeah. So, but it's a good performance. He's menacing. He's threatening. He has like personality. He shows the sides of Hopper. He's not just, I'm a mean, angry grasshopper, but he's like a little insecure about stuff. And anytime he's threatened or challenged, he has to lash out in ways that shows his bravado. He's a nice little villain.
I think it's interesting because like we find out that Hopper is generally a scared grasshopper because, he had a brush with death with the bird, or maybe not the same bird, but a bird.
Even everything he does is like rooted in insecurity. It's like he must threaten the ants because he's actually kind of afraid of the ants.
Yeah.
And if the ants realize that they can outnumber them, they'll take the grasshoppers down. So it's like a show of threat rooted in insecurity.
He's a bully essentially, and when things are going his way, like he's never actually going to do anything. He only threatens, and it's only really at the end when he becomes desperate that he starts actually acting on some of these things.
Well, he did plan to kill the queen, to be fair.
Yeah. But
they did stop him from doing it, but his plan was to get the ant to get all the food, and then as a show of force to keep them in line, he was going to step on the queen's skull.
But you wonder whether he would have gone through with it, because, we see that that's the plan, but then he seems to be quite happy once he's in control to let them entertain him as such.
Yeah, just to let it go.
So it's interesting, but I think it's a good performance. It's one of those things, again, where you separate the art from the artist. Much easier in an animated film, I must say.
Yeah, where you don't have to look at his face. You can just hear his voice. You can pretend it's not him.
But yeah, he has one of the more gruesome deaths of any Disney villain, Gar. He literally gets eaten alive.
Yeah, a ton of birds just savage him to death. It's really up there with Ratigan, who falls like, I don't know, 100 feet and splats on concrete. That's pretty gruesome as well. They
do the classic look away as the villain gets murdered.
Yeah.
Very good stuff. Another note I had here, Gar, Tuck and Roll are the original Minions.
They are. They might as well be like banana, banana, banana.
We've watched 2 of these films, Gar, now, and, I'm trying to start to figure out what the formula is that makes these films so successful. And I feel like the key to the success of these movies is that they're just good, solid entertainment. The script and jokes are played for genuine laughs, and there's no sign of cynicism or by-the-numbers children's storytelling. They're just making good films for everybody.
I think the key to Pixar's success is world building. That they, like a lot of Disney films, are films that exist to serve their individual plot and they move on. They don't feel like whole worlds that exist. They don't feel like ecosystems that exist. They feel like they introduce you to characters, they tell you the story of those characters, and then they move on from those characters. As opposed to Pixar films where they sit down and think, all right, this is a world in which toys come to life. What would that be like? How would these toys react if someone came into the room? Would they have systems in place for if they get, like, there's a buddy system. We're like, all right, we're moving. There's the buddy system. You find your buddy so you don't get lost while we're moving.
Because that's one of the things they negotiate in their lives.
Yeah, so they bring these worlds to life in a way that makes them feel like full and makes them feel not real, of course, but as if they exist outside of the plot of this movie. And the same thing is true of A Bug's Life. Like this whole ant colony that lives on this island that has all these systems and processes in place and has this succession system where the queen is passing on to the princess. And it feels like a fully realized world. And when you think of all the great Pixar films, when you think about, Monsters, Inc. in that fully realized world, or WALL-E and that fully realized world, they say like all of their ideas and all of their concepts, even Cars, which is a film people don't like particularly, at the very least thinks about like what is like this world that is just cars. What's it going to be like? how will this world operate? Like, they get down into that nitty gritty. They're not just like, the rescuers go to Australia, they save some kid, they have a fun time, we move on. That's not what Pixar generally do. And anytime Pixar do that is when you get down to like the Cars 3 level stuff, which is not B tier Pixar, but like completely dismissible Pixar, which is very rare. You know it when you see it, as opposed to like a film like Luca, which again brings a world to life in a way that's interesting and fully featured and thinks about how would these sea creatures exist in the world? How would they interact with the human people? Would there be human people? Would the human people be hunting them? Which they are. And the same thing across all of these Pixar films. They bring these worlds to life, which means, and like they tell very good stories in them. They generally look very pretty, and they look increasingly pretty as technology allows. But I think that's the central thing. That's what Pixar does. Pixar build worlds.
And they build a very controlled world because, as you said, Toy Story, it basically takes place in a child's bedroom.
Yep.
This is an ant colony, which seems big, but it's actually very small.
It's just a tree on an island. Yeah.
If you, as a human, were to walk from one end to the other, it would take you 10 seconds.
Yeah.
You know, it's just very interesting how like they create these worlds that people don't generally tell stories about. They're really, as I said, to the day-to-day life, they're inconsequential, but that's why they're interesting, because you don't give thought to those things. You still have toys in this room. You don't think about them. They're just there.
My amiibos don't come to life.
Yeah, well, maybe they do when you're not there.
Whoa.
They're on alert right now. Or the ants in the garden. You don't think about the ants in the garden. You know that they're there. But Pixar dives into these ideas like your brain is electricity. That's on the face of it what it is. But what if it wasn't?
Yes.
So I think when they're most successful, they really go places that normal storytelling doesn't. But also sometimes they use that as a formula, and it's not always successful, like Cars, for example. They do some interesting stuff, as you said, of what would this world look like. I don't think these films always have to justify their existence, but, it doesn't work all the time.
And they're telling stories that can only be told through animation. Like, you couldn't create... You can now, in 2021, you could create a live-action version of A Bug's Life. You can create a live-action, quote-unquote, version of anything. Whereas back in, like, 1990... What was this, 7? 8. Back in 98, you couldn't really create a live-action ants film. You couldn't get in with the ant bill, and it would just be some bizarre thing with people in costumes, and it would be very weird, and it would be very off-putting. The same thing with, like, you couldn't really create a live-action version of like a Toys movie, or Monsters, or all of these, like, different stories that they tell. You couldn't really create live-action versions of these movies at the time, and that's the magic of animation, isn't it? To do things that just simply cannot be done in real life. We can tell different kinds of stories through animation.
And they focus on the world, the characters, and what their motivations are, and they're developing them. Like, the story is not a means to an end. The story is the film, whereas in other animation studios, the characters are the film.
Yeah, like this is a flick of redemption story about an ant who is well-meaning but bumbling, but actually turns out to be good in the end. Princess Atta, who is this like nervous princess who's like very unsure of herself in this leadership position, but slowly over time takes ownership of that leadership position. And you even get like Richard Kind's character, who is called Molt. Like even he gets a little character arc where he's a grasshopper, so he's meant to be evil and mean, but no, he's actually kind of well-meaning and nice. But he's the brother of the angry, evil
tyrant.
Yeah. Tyrant who leads them all, but then it turns out at the end of the film he's just a nice guy who helps out the ants.
Richard Kind is great, but like that comes on to my next point. The voice talent in this movie is incredible.
Yeah, so we mentioned Kevin Spacey. You get Dave Foley as Flick. Very good performance. The kind of neurotic, anxious kind of guy.
Anxious because, he wants to help, but also because he's unsure of himself.
And fully aware of the fact that he usually ends up screwing things up, which makes him try harder and screw things up harder again. You
have a young Hayden Panettiere doing Dot. An excellent performance for a child of that age.
Yeah. Julia Louis-Dreyfus.
Yeah. As Atta.
Yeah, David Hyde Pierce. Pre-Treasure Planet David Hyde Pierce, of course.
Yes, of course.
Pixar got him first.
Yeah, and like you just have all these kind of old Hollywood actors in the roles like the Mantis and stuff like that. And Bonnie Hunt, of course, as the Black Widow. Again, I think that's part of the success of a lot of Pixar films, but especially this one, in that the voice performances are authentic and they're performing. They're not just reading lines to get a payday for a few days. They're actually inhabiting these characters and trying their best to bring them to life. Like, what's his name again?
Dennis Leary.
Dennis Leary, you know exactly what I was thinking about, as Francis the Ladybug. He even has a little arc for himself where he's like, he has a bit of a complex because people think he's a girl and he's trying to act like a tough guy, but then he realizes that he needs to embrace his feminine side.
Overcomes the transphobia and embraces it. David Hyde Pierce, though, you say people are embracing the character. David Hyde Pierce is just doing Niles again.
Yeah. In fairness, that's his bread and butter. We'll take that.
Yeah.
but every character has a story in this film, every character has a motivation, and every character plays a part. There's no throwaway characters in this film.
Yeah, and even like John Ratzenberger's like Flea character, who's just introduced and dismissed, comes back in the end. He has a little character arc, and he's like, you're gonna make me millions, but then he screws things up, and then for some reason they're like, we're still gonna go on tour with you, I guess, because they'll make them millions.
Yeah, I think they realize that he's he's one of those hucksters, those kind of grifter types, but they still belong with him because they're all the same kind of person.
Yeah, and they'll come back, I suppose.
Yeah, they'll come back next season. Overall, I think that it's a very tightly plotted film. As you said, it moves along quite quickly again, like Toy Story. The third act is tremendous, many twists and turns. A film, especially when, as we said, this technology was in its infancy, it takes a lot of effort to do, I think, 3 twists in the final act. You know, they could have gone home a lot quicker with this film, but they didn't. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, and it doesn't outsay its welcome. All the plot beat, like it, as we said, it goes to the city, it comes straight back to the city, it sets them up as heroes, it tears them down as heroes. They leave, they come back, they save the day. Hopper thinks he's defeated, but then he actually kidnaps the princess, flies up, they save each other, it's eaten by the birds, then it actually ends. That's the plot of the movie. But it's always moving. It's similar to Toy Story, and it's just always moving. It's never like, we're just going to sit here and do nothing for a half hour, like half of these Disney adventure films in the end of it, like, you know, The Princess and the Frog and all of these movies. There's like, we're going to hang out in the bayou for half an hour. It's like, okay.
Yeah, and this film is about 10 minutes longer than Toy Story, but you don't feel that.
No. As I said, I think it's a B-tier Pixar movie. And the reason I say that is, like, I don't think it has any of, like, the really, like, inventive ideas or broader themes that you get in the really, really good Pixar movies. It doesn't have that. And that's what I think separates the great Pixar movies from the very good Pixar movies. But as I mentioned, the very good Pixar movies are better than most movies. Just like A Bug's Life is better than most movies.
Yeah, this one has a satisfying character arc for Flick, and a lot of the characters actually all come full circle, but it has more traditional morals and more traditional storytelling.
Yeah.
Your hero's journey, or, you know, your setup, conflict and resolution, you know. Whereas, you know, it doesn't swing for those bigger themes, but I do think it sticks to landing in terms of what it's trying to do, the story it's trying to tell. And you do come away with that nice warm feeling that you do with a lot of Pixar films.
Yeah, because this movie does benefit from being the second one.
Yeah.
Where it's like everything is still new and fresh and different and revolutionary back in 98. Whereas if this film, it would have been obviously touched up and made look better. But if this film was released in like 2015, people would, I think, consider it in like that onward tier. It's actually quite enjoyable, but it's not among their best.
I referenced earlier the film's score, which was again composed and conducted by Pixar namestay Randy Newman. The score in this movie is so good, and like Toy Story, it's instantly recognizable. You know,
yeah. Once you hear that do 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 do, you're like, that's A Bug's Life.
As we know, Gar, there's songs in these movies. Sometimes at the end, sometimes during the movie, like in Toy Story. But we already see that it's a key part of the recipe of success in a great Pixar movie. It's never an afterthought or phoned in. It's always considered and like an integral part of the storytelling in these movies.
I think that's generally true of everything they do. It's never an afterthought. It's like there are limitations, both technical and financial, that means they can't do everything they probably ever want to do. But they do, like, it's like, all right, we're going to create a really good score for this movie. What's going to work? How's it going to, we're going to amplify every part of it with the score. It's like, we're going to amplify every part of it with the animation. We're going to try and punch up the script as much as we can. Like, it's not just churning out entertainment for entertainment's sake yet.
Yeah, they're like focusing on every aspect and trying to make it as good as it can. Not as good as it can be for children or as good as it needs to be for children.
Yeah.
It's as good as it can be.
Just full stop.
Yeah.
Or period if you're American.
If we're looking at the legacy of this film, as you said, we have a PS1 game, which wasn't very good, but at the time, that was kind of a fad where Disney released these movie games and they're basically a rehash of the film. So you played them for the novelty of playing as the characters, for the music, and for the cutscenes where you basically get to watch the movie.
Yeah, because some of these films were released either right alongside the release of the film, or some of these games were released either right alongside of the release of the film, or a couple of them were actually released a little before the movie. So you could like spoil yourself on the movie a couple of days in advance. So that's the thing. Because like the VHS was generally released like a year later, wasn't it?
Around then. Yeah.
In these days, as opposed to, you know, you could find a film on the internet these days, like literally a week after it comes out if you want to rewatch it. As opposed to back then, you would have to wait a year. So you'd buy the game just to relive the movie and see all the cutscenes.
Gar, we can't talk about A Bug's Life without mentioning the ants controversy.
Ooh, yeah. Katzenberg stealing ideas.
During production, a controversial feud erupted between Steve Jobs and the Lasseter of Pixar and DreamWorks co-founder Jeffrey Katzenberg due to the parallel production of his similar film Ants, which was released literally the same year. These two films came out in 1998.
Yeah.
It was clear that Lasseter and Jobs believed that the idea was stolen by Katzenberg. Katzenberg had stayed in touch with Lasseter after his acrimonious Disney split, often calling to check up. In October 1995, when Lasseter was overseeing post-production work on Toy Story at the Universal Technicolor facility in Universal City, where DreamWorks was also located, he called Katzenberg and dropped by with Andrew Stanton. When Katzenberg asked what they were doing next, Lasseter described what would become A Bug's Life in detail.
Oh, see, that was his first mistake, trusting Jeffrey Katzenberg.
Who, as we know, has been a consistent villain in the story of these films.
Or a ruthless villain.
Yeah, so he claims that he didn't do it, that it's just a coincidence. But also, there's a claim that he tried to extort Disney by saying that he would delay the release of Ants if they would delay the release of A Bug's Life so it didn't go up against his film, The Prince of Egypt,
Ooh.
which he also denies.
You see, have you seen Ants?
I have.
I've never seen Ants. Is it good?
It's a lot more adult. Got Woody Allen in it. It's played for older kids and adults. It's not pop culture referencey, but it's a lot more grown up than A Bug's Life. So not really a direct competitor, but at the same time, the story is almost identical.
Do you know, for the longest time, I thought Woody Allen was the director of that movie? Yeah. I was like, it's a Woody Allen movie, right? It's like, no, he's just in it.
So, it's about an oddball ant who saves the day, essentially. And that's a simplification, but if you look at the actual plots, they're beat for beat the same.
Well, I've never seen it, so I can't say. It was also a lot less successful, so who won?
Yeah, it was successful overall, but a lot less successful than A Bug's Life. But it's interesting that that happens sometimes in Hollywood. I remember in recent years as well, 2 Snow White films came out at the same time that were very similar.
2 Hercules films came out at the same time too, didn't they?
Yeah.
And Hollywood are always making 4 Tarzan films at any given time.
So it's interesting. We probably never know, but I would lean on the side of Katzenberg, because he's
stole the idea.
He's dirty as they come, Gary.
The 2 Christopher Robin movies as well.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that happens in Hollywood, but these people move in the same circles and
ideas get around and people are like, oh, let's do our own version of it. It's like, can we not do something different and new? It's like, no.
And also Katzenberg apparently put handsome financial incentives in place to try and get Ants out ahead of A Bug's Life.
Typical.
So I do believe that he stole the idea. Also, interesting you say about home video, Gar. This was the first film to be digitally transferred frame by frame and released on DVD.
Oh.
I do remember A Bug's Life being one of the earlier DVDs.
DVDs? That must have been very expensive.
Yeah, it was.
Well, I don't remember getting DVDs until the mid-2000s regularly.
Yeah. It's one of those things that it was a technology that was around for a lot longer than when it became successful.
And you had the DVD recorders after videotape. I thought it was recording RAW every night in those DVDs.
I think it's very interesting how when DVD first came out, it was on VHS and DVD, and then it became the opposite, and then VHS just disappeared.
Yeah.
So then it's on DVD and VHS.
I think kids these days don't know how it feels to have a stack of videotapes, or remember those reams of CDs you used to get?
Yeah.
So you could record things instead of just pushing a button and getting it these days. Everything's digital now. Kids didn't have to have physical tapes that they had to rewind or, God forbid, tape over when you'd run out of tapes, and then you had to make some really dangerous decisions, Ken. What do you delete? What do you tape over?
Yeah, because what do you want to keep? And I do remember the rewritable DVDs being a game changer. Obviously it's archaic now, but it was wow, you can put this show on a DVD, and then put a different show.
You want.
Yeah, and then put a different show on it. And it's, in fairness, the more you use them, the less good it got. So you have to kind of use a new one eventually, because eventually
it just broke down. The disc just didn't work anymore.
Or even if it did
Same
work,
with tapes were even less reliable.
Yeah, it'd skip, or the quality was degraded over time. But yeah, that's A Bug's Life, Gar.
Yeah, they should make a movie about a tape that's a lot. It's like Wreck-It Ralph, where everything that's on the tape is real.
Yeah.
But every time it gets re-recorded over, it changes complete style. So you record a 70s movie and all the characters on the tape are in the 70s, but then they record Hocus Pocus and suddenly everybody becomes witches. There you go, movie idea.
There you go, Pixar.
Yeah, make that.
That's your next one. And you can put in all the Disney movies and stuff.
Yeah. But you record The Little Mermaid, suddenly everybody becomes fish.
They're blank slates, and whatever is recorded, they become the version of that, the style of it. Okay, we know Disney are listening to us because we consume many Disney products. So if that becomes a film, we're gonna.
If Jeffrey Katzenberg steals that from me, there will be war.
Who's that in the garden? Get out of here, Katzenberg!
Just a Quibi failed doesn't mean you can't hang out in our garden.
But Garrett, I think you hit the nail on the head. A Bug's Life is not Pixar firing on all cylinders, but it is
a very enjoyable movie.
It's very satisfying, and I'm going to give it a B+. I'm going to elevate it above B tier Pixar, possibly because
nostalgia.
When I watched it, it was still new and exciting, and but I do think it does get a lot of things right, but it just doesn't reach for those higher themes to elevate it to the higher tier.
As I said, I kind of like the idea of there also always being like the just, good Pixar movies instead of the revolutionary ones. And that's the reason I'm saying officially A Bug's Life is the birth of B-tier Pixar, which I've now been able to say without messing up, I think, at least twice.
Alrighty, ladybugs. Sadly, it's nearly time for us to buzz off for another week. Resident Magic by Design singer Nicole is coming up in just a few minutes with a song from A Bug's Life, so stay tuned for a musical treat at the end of the show. New episodes of Magic by Design land every Monday, where all magical podcasts are downloaded. Stop by the website at magicbydesign.buzzsprout.com to find a full list of podcast platforms. We are literally everywhere: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, you name it, we're on it. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or even on YouTube, so you never miss an episode. Join our colony by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/magicbydesignpod, on Twitter at magicdesignpod, and on Insta at magicbydesignpod. If you love the show and want your friends and loved ones to know what they're missing, why not give the show a review on your podcast platform of choice? 5 stars or go home, of course.
Yes, give us all the stars. Give us 6. Try and give us 6.
Yeah. Write to the platform that you're on if they don't offer 6 stars and say, I want to give this podcast 6 stars.
That's how good it is.
If you give us a 5-star review, you could win a family pass to P.T. Flea's circus to see the flaming death in the flesh.
It'll be very small though, so it won't seem very impressive to you because he's a flea. So you might not even be able to see it, frankly. But it's going to be very impressive, trust us.
Do you know what? We'll even throw in a magnifying glass.
Ooh.
If you win.
Don't do it in the sun. You've seen what happens with the magnifying glasses and sun in Pixar movies.
Yeah.
Don't burn the fleas.
Next week, we'll be reviewing Pixar's third animated feature, Toy Story 2. It feels weird that Toy Story 2 is so soon.
It reminds me of the MCU where you're just like, Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2. It's like, It doesn't feel like it should be like that, but it is.
Yeah. So be sure to join us for that. But until then, stay safe and remember, together, even the smallest can achieve the greatest goal. Not necessarily true, but... Now then, the time has come. Nicole is here to play us out with The Time of Your Life from A Bug's Life. Thanks for listening. Now, take us home, Nicole.
Was a bug, a little bug, hardly there. How we felt, what he dreamed, who would care? Without any evidence,
his boss of many
was full of confidence.
Some people haven't any
Didn't have much common sense.
It's highly overrated.
He just knew that he'd come through. It's the time of your life, so live it well. It's the time of your life, so live it well. You may only go round just one time, as far as I can tell. It's the time of your life. It's the time of your life. It's the time of your life, so live it well. Like us all, he started small, then he grew. When the time came, he knew what to do. He knew in order to succeed, he turned a rock into a sea. Then they had the strength they'd need. Do or die, you gotta try. It's the time of your life, so live it well. It's the time of your life, so live it well. You may only go round one time, as far as I can tell. It's the time of your life, so live it well. Isn't it a bit surprising how one's fortunes ebb and flow, and only to the enterprising does the magic fortune cookie go? Believe believe me. It's a time